Cryos 9 was the kind of planet that killed trained soldiers in under 3 days. Temperatures dropped below -130 degrees. Storms erased entire research stations beneath the ice. 7 alien species tried surviving there. Every single one failed. So when a distress beacon suddenly activated from the surface, after 10 years of silence, the Galactic Union assumed it was a malfunction because no intelligent life could still be alive down there. But they were wrong. One human had survived alone beneath the ice for an entire decade, and what the rescue team discovered on that frozen world would permanently change how the galaxy viewed humanity. If you enjoy dark sci-fi survival stories, HFY, and cinematic space storytelling, make sure to subscribe and stay until the end. Because this story is not about a super soldier or an overpowered hero. It's about an ordinary human being too stubborn to die. The signal arrived at Station Capri 12 at ISO 37 Ship Standard Time, buried beneath 6 years of cosmic background interference and frozen static from the outer Perseus drift. Technician Ilrin almost dismissed it as another phantom echo from a dead relay buoy. Cryos 9 sat far beyond the mapped commercial corridors, isolated inside a sector of unstable magnetized space where long-range transmissions warped, fragmented, and often repeated themselves decades after the source had vanished. Nothing reliable ever came from that region. Nothing alive certainly did. Yet, the moment the waveform stabilized on his screen, Ilrin felt something tighten inside his chest cavity. The pulse pattern was deliberate, manual, human. He leaned closer to the monitor as another burst arrived through the noise. 3 short pulses. Pause, too long, pause, repeat. Emergency distress cadence. Old Earth format. His upper hands froze above the console. Supervisor, he called quietly, uncertain why he had lowered his voice. I need to see this. Across the dim operations chamber, Senior Controller Varesh looked up with visible annoyance. The night cycle on Capri 12 was uneventful 99% of the time, mostly cargo routing and deep space telemetry audits. No one expected surprises near the drift. Varesh approached the station array with slow irritation until Ilrin replayed the signal. The older alien's expression changed instantly. Source? Ilrin swallowed. Triangulation still processing. Another pulse crackled through the speakers, distorted but unmistakably artificial. The station AI projected the origin coordinates into the air between them. Cryos 9. Silence spread across the room. Even the distant hum of the servers seemed muted for a moment. Varesh stared at the coordinates as though the system itself had malfunctioned. That is impossible, he said. Ilrin did not answer, because he agreed. Cryos 9 had earned its classification nearly 30 years earlier during the failed Perseus Biological Adaptation Initiative. 7 species from the Galactic Union had attempted long-term survival trials on the frozen world. Every attempt ended in catastrophic mortality. The atmosphere itself was unstable, filled with microscopic ice particulates, sharp enough to shred respiratory membranes. Surface temperatures regularly dropped below -130 degrees Celsius. Electromagnetic storms rolled endlessly across the plains, disabling electronics and trapping rescue craft in orbit for weeks at a time. Entire research stations had vanished beneath migrating glaciers. After the Arcturus expedition disappeared 10 years ago, the Union Senate permanently blacklisted the planet. No vessel was authorized to land there again. No intelligent life could survive Cryos 9, yet the signal continued. Precise, rhythmic, intentional. Varesh activated secure command protocols immediately. Within 20 minutes, the transmission reached Sector Fleet Command. Within 40, it reached the private chamber of Captain Varik. The old commander had not slept properly in years. Even before the encrypted call arrived, he was awake in darkness aboard the patrol cruiser Vindicator, reviewing casualty archives from a war long finished. His quarters were silent except for the low vibration of the ship engines and the faint clicking of cooling pipes behind the walls. When the transmission request appeared above his desk, he almost ignored it. Then he saw the classification tag, Cryos 9 priority signal. Varric accepted immediately. Station Kepri 12 relayed the waveform into his chamber. The moment he heard the pulse sequence, old memories returned with brutal clarity. White storms swallowing rescue craft whole. Emergency beacons buried beneath kilometers of ice, bodies frozen standing upright in the snow. He remembered the Arcturus. He remembered abandoning them. The signal repeated again. Human cadence, manual timing. Someone alive was pressing that beacon switch. How long has this transmission been active? Varric asked. Unknown, Varesh Farag replied through the hologram. The interference felt likely masked weaker emissions for years. We only isolated the pattern tonight after recalibrating the deep array filters. Varric listened again without speaking. His species valued logic above instinct, but instinct whispered now regardless. Something was wrong. Run atmospheric refraction analysis, he ordered. Determine whether the signal could be an old relay reflection. Already completed, Varesh answered. The pulses contain variants. Varric narrowed his eyes. Variants? Yes, Captain. Inconsistent timing between sequences, micro delays, human-level fatigue patterns. The room fell silent again. Varric slowly leaned back into his chair. 10 years earlier, he had commanded the final rescue operation above Cryos 9. He still remembered the exact moment Fleet Control ordered evacuation. Their ships were losing stabilization inside the magnetic storms. Another hour in orbit would have destroyed the entire task force. The surviving crew of the Arcturus had been unreachable beneath the storm systems. Officially, the mission was terminated due to total survivability collapse. Unofficially, Varric had carried the shame ever since. Captain? Varesh asked carefully. Do you recognize the transmission format? Varric answered without hesitation. Yes, he opened a classified personnel archive from memory. Ethan Ward, human. Maintenance engineer second class, no combat specialization, no command authority. Psychological evaluations. Stable, introverted, mechanically adaptive. The file image showed a young man with tired eyes and an uneven smile standing beside a reactor conduit aboard the Arcturus. Varric remembered him vaguely. Quiet, forgettable. The kind of crewman no commander notices until systems stop functioning. Prepare my ship, Varric said. So you intend to investigate personally? I intend, Varric replied, to determine what is transmitting from a dead planet. Far beyond the monitored trade lanes of the Union, Cryos 9 rotated slowly beneath an ocean of storm clouds. The planet looked lifeless, even from orbit, a white sphere wrapped in permanent darkness. Vast glaciers crawled across frozen continents like living things. Lightning moved constantly inside the atmosphere, illuminating mountain ranges buried beneath ice older than recorded civilization. Winds exceeding 400 kilometers per hour carved trenches through the snowfields. Nothing natural should have endured there. Buried beneath layers of ice and wreckage, a faint emergency beacon blinked against the storm. Inside a shelter assembled from scavenged hull plating and reactor insulation, Ethan Ward tightened a frozen connector cable with trembling hands. The shelter shook violently around him as another magnetic storm rolled across the plains outside. Frost crept along the interior walls despite the heating units roaring at maximum capacity. Every breath burned his lungs. The generator lights flickered again. Power fluctuation rising, said a mechanical voice behind him. Ethan glanced toward the hovering drone near the ceiling. Mira 7's optical sensors glowed dim blue through scratches and old impact damage. Half her outer shell had been replaced with mismatched metal scavenged from the Arcturus wreckage. I noticed, Ethan muttered. His beard was thick now, streaked with frost and gray. Old scars crossed his face where ice exposure had split skin years earlier. He looked older than 40, though he was barely 35. External temperature drop accelerating, Mira continued. Storm severity exceeds prior projections by 17%. Ethan gave a dry laugh. You always say that. Outside, something massive groaned beneath the ice fields. The sound vibrated through the shelter floor like the planet itself shifting in pain. Ethan ignored it and continued repairing the transmitter array manually. The beacon housing had frozen again. He scraped ice from the relay pins with numb fingers while the emergency signal pulsed weakly into the void above the storms. 3 short, 2 long. Repeat. Transmission cycle complete, Mira reported. Ethan leaned back against the wall, breathing hard. Any response? The drone remained silent for half a second too long. Negative. He nodded once as though he had expected nothing else. 10 years of silence trained expectations out of a person. Still, he transmitted every day, sometimes every hour during clear atmospheric windows, not because he believed rescue was coming anymore. That belief had died years ago. The ritual itself mattered now. As long as the beacon continued, so did he. Ethan slowly stood and crossed the shelter toward the heating unit. Every movement carried the weight of exhaustion, layered over countless previous days, exactly like this one. The shelter around him was a graveyard of salvaged survival, patched oxygen filters, cracked display screens, thermal piping welded from engine conduits, ration containers stacked into insulation walls. The place no longer resembled a ship module. It resembled an organism adapted painfully over years to resist extinction. Near the far wall sat a small metal table. 2 bowls rested there beside a faded deck of playing cards. 1 bowl remained untouched. Myra's optic lens shifted toward it. "You have not consumed sufficient calories today," she observed. Ethan opened a sealed protein packet. "I'll eat. Your metabolic decline exceeds safe thresholds. Mira." "Yes." Quiet. The drone obeyed immediately. Ethan sat alone at the table while storms screamed beyond the shelter walls. He forced himself to eat slowly, even though the food tasted like chemical paste. Across from him, the empty bowl remained untouched, exactly where he had placed it years earlier. Some habits were harder to kill than hope. The lights flickered again. Then everything went dark. Silence swallowed the shelter except for distant wind. Ethan closed his eyes. "Tell me that's not the main generator." Mira paused. "It is the main generator." Ethan exhaled slowly through clenched teeth. Outside, thunder rolled across the frozen plains. The storm had arrived early. He stood again without complaint and reached for his thermal suit hanging beside the airlock. The fabric was worn thin from constant repairs. Ice crystals already formed across the outer seals. Smira floated closer. External survival probability is critically low. Ethan secured the cracked helmet collar and checked the remaining oxygen charge. Still not zero. The drone hesitated, almost human in the pause. "You said that before?" Ethan managed the faintest smile. "Yeah." Then he opened the outer hatch. Instantly, the storm hit like a physical blow. White wind exploded into the shelter, carrying razor ice sharp enough to cut exposed skin within seconds. Ethan forced himself into the blizzard, one step at a time, while darkness swallowed him almost immediately. Behind him, the emergency beacon continued its slow pulse into deep space. 3 short, 2 long. Repeat. Somewhere far beyond the storms, beyond the frozen orbit and silent stars, Captain Voshrick's ship accelerated toward Cryos 9. 10 years earlier, long before Cryos 9 became a forbidden graveyard, whispered about in military academies and deep space stations, the planet had seemed merely difficult instead of impossible. The research vessel, Arcturus, entered orbit, carrying 42 crew members from 5 species under the authority of the Galactic Union Science Directorate. Officially, the mission existed to investigate the unusual geothermal signatures beneath the planet's southern ice shelf. Unofficially, the Union hoped Cryos 9 contained a rare subglacial energy lattice capable of powering frontier colonies for centuries. Entire sectors depended on the discovery succeeding. The Arcturus itself was not a military vessel, despite the escort personnel aboard. It was old, heavily modified, and perpetually vibrating somewhere behind the walls like a machine already tired of surviving space travel. Ethan Ward loved it immediately. He always liked broken things. Most people aboard barely noticed him during the first weeks of transit. He was maintenance staff, second-class engineering division, responsible for keeping atmospheric seals, thermal relays, and utility systems operational. Important work, but invisible when functioning correctly. Ethan preferred it that way. While officers attended strategy briefings and science argued over sensor data, he spent most of the journey inside access tunnels, with a toolkit strapped to his waist and music playing softly through old headphones. He understood machines more easily than people. Machines failed for reasons that could be fixed. People were harder. "You're the human mechanic, right?" A voice asked one cycle while Ethan crawled halfway inside a damaged coolant shaft. He slid back out to find a woman standing outside the maintenance corridor, holding a medical scanner in one hand. Lena Volkov, human, expedition medic. Dark hair tied carelessly behind her head, eyes sharp with permanent exhaustion. "Depends," Ethan answered. "Did something explode?" "Not yet." She handed him a thermal canister. "You missed evening meal rotation again." Ethan accepted the drink with surprise. "Thanks. Captain says if the heating grid fails during descent, we all die screaming." She nodded toward the open shaft. "So technically you're more important than the science team." Ethan snorted quietly. "Don't let them hear you say that. That was the beginning. Not friendship exactly, at least not immediately. But afterward, Lena started appearing in maintenance sectors more often, usually carrying coffee or complaints about the officers. Ethan discovered she used sarcasm the way other people used armor. She discovered he listened more than he talked. Somewhere during the long journey toward Cryos 9, the silence between them became comfortable. The Arcturus reached orbit without incident. That was the last easy day any of them would ever experience. From space, Cryos 9 resembled a dead star frozen solid. Endless white storms covered most of the surface. Sensor readings fluctuated constantly due to magnetic interference rising from beneath the crust. Even orbit was unstable. The planet generated electromagnetic tides powerful enough to distort navigation systems every few hours. During the first command briefing, Captain Varik stood before the assembled crew with military stillness. "Surface conditions exceed prior projections," he stated. "Exposure outside insulated zones will result in death within minutes. Atmospheric instability may disrupt communications for extended periods. Standard survival protocol remains in effect at all times." Behind him, planetary scans rotated slowly above the table. Glaciers hundreds of kilometers wide, mountain ranges entombed beneath ice, storms large enough to swallow cities whole. Someone near the back muttered, "Why does anyone want this place?" Varik heard him. "Because civilizations are built by those willing to go where others refuse." Ethan remembered that line years later while freezing alone in darkness. At the time, it simply sounded like something officers said before dangerous assignments. The landing operation began 72 hours later. Massive drilling platforms descended first, followed by atmospheric processors and prefabricated shelter modules. The Arcturus remained in low orbit while surface teams established Base Theta near the southern geothermal anomaly. Initial conditions were survivable, though barely. Surface temperatures hovered around -90°C during calm periods. Calm periods rarely lasted more than 2 hours. Ethan spent the first week repairing storm damage faster than automated systems could compensate for it. Ice accumulated everywhere. Airlocks, solar arrays, thermal intakes. The wind screamed constantly against the habitat walls like an animal trying to claw its way inside. Most alien crew members struggled immediately with the cold. Species from warmer systems required heated suits even indoors after minor power fluctuations. Human personnel adapted better, though better on Cryos 9 still meant bruised lungs and permanent exhaustion. "Your species is biologically absurd," complained senior researcher Thalik one evening after watching Ethan walked through a half-frozen maintenance corridor carrying replacement power cells. Thalic's breathing apparatus hissed rapidly from cold stress. You perspire, lose heat, then continue functioning anyway. Ethan shrugged. Earth weather tries to kill us too. Not like this. No, Ethan admitted quietly. Not like this. Despite the conditions, the mission progressed. Deep scans confirmed enormous energy signatures beneath the southern ice shelf. Geological teams theorized an ancient crystalline network existed below the crust, generating heat through unknown processes. If harnessed correctly, it could revolutionize Union energy production. That possibility blinded people to risk, including Varric, including everyone. 3 weeks after landing, drilling operations began. Ethan was beneath Platform 3 repairing thermal regulators. When the first treasure at first, it felt minor, just a vibration through the ice floor. Then warning alarms exploded across the facility simultaneously. Magnetic surge detected, shouted someone over the comms. All crews evacuate drilling sectors immediately. The ground beneath Ethan lurched violently. Overhead lights burst in showers of sparks. He scrambled from the maintenance trench just as the ice around Platform 3 cracked open with a sound like thunder splitting the planet apart. Blue-white energy erupted from the fissure beneath the drilling site. Not fire, something strange. Raw electromagnetic discharge twisted upward into the storm clouds, illuminating the entire horizon. Every electronic system nearby failed instantly. Ethan hit the ground as pressure waves rolled across the base. Above him, one of the drilling towers collapsed sideways into the ice storm. Screams filled the comms. Then static swallowed everything. The disaster lasted less than 4 minutes. It destroyed the expedition. The eruption destabilized the geothermal shelf beneath Base Theta, triggering chain reactions across the region. Communications arrays burned out. Navigation satellites crashed from orbit. The Arcturus suffered catastrophic damage when electromagnetic surges overloaded its reactor, shielding overhead. Entire sections of the ship lost power. One escort shuttle exploded during descent. Another vanished inside the storm systems and never reappeared. By the time emergency crews regrouped, 17 personnel were already dead. Ethan spent the next 16 hours without sleep, helping recover survivors from collapsed sectors. He found bodies frozen beneath shattered bulkheads, faces hidden beneath layers of ice forming almost immediately in the open air. One alien engineer died while Ethan tried sealing a ruptured oxygen line with his bare hands. Another crew member suffocated after atmospheric scrubbers failed during transport. Everywhere, people shouted conflicting orders while storms battered the shelters harder each hour. Varric imposed control through sheer force of will. Inventory all surviving systems, he ordered during the emergency council. Ration power immediately. Repair priorities are communications, heat, oxygen, then transport. Transport is impossible, argued one scientist. Orbit conditions are collapsing. Then we survive until extraction becomes possible. It sounded simple when he said it. Survival rarely does in the beginning. The first real problem emerged 3 days later. The cold was affecting different species unevenly. Several alien crew members developed tissue crystallization inside exposed respiratory membranes, despite environmental protection. Others suffered neurological degradation from cryosnine magnetic fluctuations. Humans resisted longer. Not immune, just slower to break. "You're still functioning, Lena?" asked Ethan one night, after treating frost damage on another crewman. Ethan sat beside a portable heater replacing cracked circuit boards. Barely. She studied him carefully. Dark circles had already formed beneath his eyes. "You should rest. If the thermal grid dies, nobody rests." Lena smiled faintly. "You know that's unhealthy, right?" Ethan glanced around the crowded shelter. Injured personnel lay wrapped in emergency blankets while generators rattled under strain nearby. Outside, the storm howled without pause. "This whole planet feels unhealthy." She laughed quietly despite herself. It was the last normal conversation either of them would have for a very long time. Days blended together afterward. Repair, rationing, freezing sleep, equipment failures multiplied constantly. Every solution brought only temporary survival. The base had been designed for scientific operations, not permanent isolation. Food reserves were limited. Heating systems consumed enormous energy. The magnetic storms blocked long-range transmissions almost completely. Rescue attempts from orbit failed repeatedly due to atmospheric instability. Then came the first death from hopelessness instead of cold. A navigation officer named Cyril walked outside during storm conditions without a suit beacon activated. Search teams found him 6 hours later, less than 200 meters from the shelter entrance, frozen upright against a ridge of ice. His hands were still extended forward as though he had believed he could see home somewhere inside the white darkness. After that, fear changed shape among the crew. Before Cyril died, everyone still believed rescue delays were temporary. Afterward, silence spread through the base like another storm. Ethan noticed people speaking less during meal rotations. Some stopped removing their survival suits entirely, as though expecting evacuation orders any moment. Others became obsessive about ration counts or power reports. Nobody trusted the future anymore. One evening, while repairing a damaged utility drone, Ethan noticed the machine attempting to reboot despite severe core corruption. "Persistent little thing," he muttered. The drone's optic sensor flickered weakly. Designation: Mira 7, Utility Support AI, extensive damage. Ethan almost scrapped it for parts. Instead, he carried the broken machine back to maintenance. "You're keeping that?" Lena asked. "Maybe." "Why?" Ethan tightened a cable connection. "Because it's still trying." Lena watched him for a moment longer than necessary. "You know," she said softly, "that might be the most human answer I've ever heard." Outside the shelter walls, Cryos 9 continued grinding everything slowly toward extinction. And far above, the storms hidden beneath layers of interference and orbital debris, the first faint fragments of a distress beacon began trying to reach the stars. The first month after the disaster became the measure by which every later nightmare would be judged. At first, the survivors still counted time normally. Shift rotations continued. Meal periods remained scheduled. Varric held command briefings every 6 hours even when no meaningful updates existed. The structure mattered. Without structure, panic spread faster than cold. But Cryos 9 was patient. The planet did not kill quickly. It stripped away systems one layer at a time until survival itself became exhausting. The storms never stopped. Entire days vanished behind white atmospheric chaos, so dense external visibility dropped below 2 meters. Magnetic interference distorted instruments constantly. Power reserves dwindled faster than calculations predicted because the heaters operated continuously at emergency output. Worse, the survivors began learning the planet attacked each species differently. The Tauran scientists lost peripheral nervous control after prolonged exposure to the magnetic fields. The Vekari technicians developed microfractures in respiratory tissue from the frozen air despite environmental filtration. Even the military escorts began showing cognitive fatigue after weeks without natural daylight cycles. Humans endured longer, though endurance came with its own price. Sleep became shallow and fragmented. Joints ached constantly from the cold. Breathing hurt. Everyone developed a cough eventually. Ethan stopped noticing his own pain after a while because there was always another system failing somewhere inside Base Theta. He moved through the station almost mechanically now, carrying tools from one emergency repair to another, while alarms echoed endlessly through the corridors. Heating conduits ruptured daily from ice expansion. Oxygen scrubbers froze without warning. Hot water recyclers jammed with crystalline residue from the planet's atmosphere. Every repaired system bought only temporary stability before something else failed. "You need to slow down," Lena told him. After finding him asleep beside an open thermal regulator one cycle, Ethan jerked awake instantly, disoriented. He had not even realized he'd fallen asleep. His fingers were still wrapped around a diagnostic scanner. "I'm fine," he muttered automatically. Lena crouched beside him and pressed a scanner against his neck before he could protest. "You're running a fever, probably because it's -100 outside, and because you haven't slept properly in 4 days." Ethan rubbed his eyes. The maintenance corridor around them vibrated softly with distant generators strain. "If I stop working, people freeze." Lena stared at him for several seconds before answering quietly. "You talk like you're personally holding the station together." Ethan looked away because lately it felt true. He did not say that out loud. Instead, he forced himself upright and returned to the regulator panel. Lena remained beside him longer than necessary. "You know what the problem with humans is?" she asked eventually. "Several things come to mind. You people keep functioning after smarter species know they should quit." Ethan snorted faintly. "That sounds less like a problem." "That's because you're human." She smiled tiredly and handed him a sealed nutrition pack before leaving. Ethan watched her disappear down the corridor, then quietly placed the ration aside for later. He forgot to eat it entirely. As weeks passed, desperation transformed the station atmosphere. Conversations grew shorter, tempers sharper. Every resource report triggered arguments. Captain Varick maintained discipline with brutal efficiency, but even he could not prevent fear from mutating into division. During one emergency council meeting, senior researcher Thalek slammed both upper limbs against the command table hard enough to rattle the displays. "This station is unsustainable," he snapped. "Power reserves decline 13% every cycle. We should abandon secondary sectors immediately." "Those sectors contain hydroponic infrastructure," another officer argued. "Without them, we lose long-term food viability." "There is no long-term viability." The room fell silent at that. Nobody wanted to say the truth aloud. Rescue operations had ceased 3 days earlier after 2 Union ships suffered from catastrophic systems failures, attempting atmospheric descent. Official transmissions from orbit became increasingly vague afterward, weather conditions unstable. Rescue postponed pending recalibration. Maintain survival protocol. Everyone understood what it meant. The Union was pulling back. Vakrik remained motionless at the center of the chamber while arguments escalated around him. Enough," he said finally. Silence returned instantly. "We survive by maintaining order. Anyone unwilling to contribute to station stability will be confined." Thalek's voice lowered dangerously. "You are asking us to die slowly." Varick's expression never changed. "I am asking you to survive as long as possible." "There is a difference." Varick did not answer because there wasn't. Ethan spent most of these meetings in the background repairing damaged terminals or recalibrating environmental controls. People rarely noticed maintenance workers until systems failed. That invisibility allowed him to observe things others missed. He noticed military personnel secretly reducing their own rations to stabilize supply projections. He noticed scientists falsifying optimism in official reports to prevent morale collapse. He noticed crew members staring too long at frozen observation windows where storms erased the horizon completely. Most of all, he noticed how quickly hopelessness exhausted people faster than the cold ever could. The first physical fight started during the 7th week. Nothing dramatic at first. Arguments over power allocation, medical priority disputes, accusations of hoarding supplies. The station population had dropped from 42 to 31 by then. Every death tightened the psychological pressure further. Some simply stopped trying. Others became obsessively determined to control whatever little remained. Meanwhile, Ethan continued fixing impossible problems with whatever materials existed nearby. When heating ducts failed, he rerouted exhaust through abandoned maintenance shafts. When water processors jammed, he rebuilt filtration systems from salvaged engine membranes. When emergency batteries degraded beyond safety limits, he disassembled damaged drones to construct crude replacements manually. "How are you doing this?" asked Lieutenant Soren one evening while watching Ethan weld thermal pipes together inside the lower generator room. Ethan adjusted his visor against flying sparks. "Doing what?" "Keeping things operational." Ethan glanced around the room. Condensation froze instantly against the walls, despite the heat radiating from exposed machinery. "It's mostly panic and bad decisions," Soren almost laughed. "Almost. You understand, most species would already have collapsed completely under these conditions." Ethan tightened another connector. "Humans collapsed too. Not like this. No one did." Even Ethan began realizing something uncomfortable during those months. Humans adapted to suffering in ways the other species did not fully comprehend. Not immunity, not strength, something stranger, persistence. Humans normalized misery frighteningly fast. Once the pain became routine, they simply kept moving. Lena noticed it too. "You know why the aliens are scared of us?" she asked during a rare, quiet meal together inside the medical wing. Ethan sat across from her, wrapped in 2 thermal blankets while the lights flickered overhead. "Because we're charming? Because they think endurance should have limits." She stirred tasteless nutrient broth slowly. "Humans treat limits like suggestions." Ethan looked around the nearly empty infirmary. 4 beds remained occupied. 2 patients no longer responded to treatment. "Feels like we're reaching ours." Lena's expression dimmed slightly. "Maybe," she coughed suddenly into her sleeve. The sound was wet, deep. Ethan frowned immediately. "You okay?" "Ice particulates," she said too quickly. Everyone's lungs are irritated, but she avoided eye contact afterward. Over the next several days, her cough worsened. Ethan noticed her pausing between sentences to catch breath. The medical scanners confirmed microscopic crystal damage spreading through lung tissue. Human physiology tolerated the environment better than most species, but prolonged exposure still destroyed the body eventually. Lena understood the diagnosis before anyone said it aloud. She simply continued working. Then came the migration proposal. It began as rumor spreading through maintenance corridors before reaching official command channels. Several long-range scans had identified remnants of an abandoned mining outpost nearly 80 kilometers east of Base Theta. The facility predated the Union expeditions by decades and might still contain operational geothermal reactors beneath the ice. The possibility ignited hope dangerously fast. "It's suicide," Varick stated during the emergency council. "The storms alone would kill half the expedition before arrival." "Staying here kills all of us eventually," Thalick countered immediately. "The outpost may possess functioning energy reserves. It is our only remaining chance." Arguments lasted hours. Ethan remained near the back repairing damaged sensor relays, while voices rose across the chamber. In the end, desperation won. A convoy would attempt the crossing using modified crawler transports and insulated survival rigs, volunteers only. Nearly half the remaining crew signed immediately. Hope made people reckless. Lena did not volunteer. Ethan considered it briefly before rejecting the idea entirely. The planet itself felt wrong beyond the station boundaries. Every maintenance trip outside reinforced that instinct. Cryos 9 wanted movement punished. "You think they'll make it?" Lena asked quietly while watching the convoy prepare near the outer airlocks. Ethan stared through the observation window at figures moving through endless snow beneath floodlights. "No," he answered honestly. Lena nodded once. "Me neither." The convoy departed during a temporary weather lull. 6 crawler transports disappeared gradually into the white horizon, while the remaining crew monitored their progress through intermittent telemetry bursts. For the first several hours, everything appeared stable. Then the storm shifted. Ethan was repairing atmospheric seals in Sector 4 when the first emergency transmission arrived. Static drowned most of the message. He caught fragments only. Visibility gone, guidance failing. Then screaming, then silence. Rescue attempts were impossible immediately due to the storm intensity. Varric ordered all crews remain inside while communication officers desperately tried re-establishing contact. By morning, only one signal remained active, a single crawler beacon transmitting from somewhere beneath the storm systems. Then it vanished too. Search teams recovered the wreckage 3 days later, after conditions stabilized enough for limited surface operations. Ethan never forgot what they found. One transport lay upside down, half buried in ice. Another had been crushed against a frozen ridge by storm-force winds. Bodies remained strapped inside survival harnesses exactly where death found them. Frozen expressions stared blankly through layers of frost. No survivors. The station population dropped to 19. After the convoy disaster, something inside Base Theta finally broke. Nobody spoke about rescue anymore. Conversations became purely functional. Eat, repair, sleep, survive one more day. Even Varric looked older now, exhaustion visible beneath rigid military composure. Ethan spent nearly every waking hour working because stopping meant thinking. Thinking meant realizing how impossible everything had become. Mira 7 gradually became his constant companion during repairs. The damaged utility drone floated beside him through maintenance shafts and frozen corridors, assisting with diagnostics whenever its corrupted systems cooperated. Ethan continued rebuilding the AI piece by piece from salvaged components. "Your repairs are inefficient," Mira observed during one late-night generator overhaul. Ethan tightened a bolt manually. "That's because I'm improvising." Improvisation increases failure probability, yeah? So does freezing to death. The drone paused. Observation accepted. Ethan smiled faintly despite himself. Small moments like that mattered more than he admitted. They reminded him something besides. Despair still existed inside the station. Then Lena collapsed during medical rotation. Ethan heard the emergency call while replacing coolant relays near the outer thermal grid. By the time he reached the infirmary, she was sitting upright on a bed, struggling to breathe, while another medic adjusted oxygen flow regulators. Blood stained the edge of her sleeve from coughing. "Everyone out," she rasped when she saw him. "Except Ethan." The others obeyed reluctantly. Silence settled over the infirmary once the doors sealed. Ethan approached slowly. "You should told me it got this bad." Lena laughed weakly. "You were busy trying to keep civilization alive." He sat beside the bed without answering. Frost coated the infirmary windows behind them. Somewhere distant, another storm battered the station walls. "I checked the scans myself," she said quietly after a while. "Damage is spreading too fast." Ethan stared at the floor. "Maybe if we adjust the filters?" "Ethan." He stopped. Lena reached for his hand. Her fingers felt freezing despite the heated room. "Listen to me." He hated how calm her voice sounded. "The beacon still works, right?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Mostly." "Then promise me something." He already knew what she would ask before she said it. "Keep transmitting." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "Lena, promise me." Her grip tightened weakly. "Even if nobody answers, even if everyone else is gone, keep the beacon alive." Ethan looked at her for a long moment while fear pressed against his ribs harder than the planet's gravity ever had. Finally, he nodded once. "Okay." Lena smiled faintly, exhausted but real. Good. Neither of them realized then that the promise would become the center of Ethan's entire existence for the next 10 years. The station lost 3 more people before the month ended. One died during a reactor coolant breach. Another never woke after hypothermic sleep failure. Another simply vanished during storm repairs, swallowed by the white wilderness beyond the airlocks. Base Theta continued shrinking both physically and emotionally. Sectors abandoned one by one to conserve power. Yet every cycle, no matter how damaged the systems became, Ethan climbed into the communications room and manually activated the distress beacon toward the stars. 3 short pulses, too long. Repeat. Somewhere far above the storms, beyond the dead orbit and endless static, the universe remained silent. Captain Varric made the decision to evacuate Base Theta 3 days after Lena died. Officially, he framed it as a tactical withdrawal to preserve remaining survivors until orbital rescue conditions improved. In reality, everyone understood the truth before he spoke it aloud. The station was finished. Power reserves had fallen below sustainable levels. Atmospheric processors failed faster than repairs could stabilize them, and the storms had intensified into something almost geological, vast rotating systems that covered entire continents for weeks at a time. Cryos 9 was not merely hostile. It was consuming them gradually, methodically, until survival itself became mathematically impossible. Ethan barely remembered the meeting where Varric announced the evacuation protocols. Exhaustion had turned time into fragments by then. He remembered the commander standing rigid beneath flickering emergency lights. He remembered the silence after the casualty projections appeared on screen. Most of all, he remembered realizing there were not enough functioning colon transport seats for everyone still alive. Priority will be determined by survival probability and operational necessity, Varric stated evenly. No one argued immediately because everyone was doing the calculations internally. Injured personnel, non-essential specialists, those too weak to survive atmospheric transfer. Cryos 9 had finally forced the station into the oldest equation in existence. Who lives? Who doesn't? Ethan sat near the back of the chamber, staring at nothing while names appeared across the allocation roster. He did not hear his own at first. Ward, someone repeated. Engineering Transport Group 2. Ethan looked up slowly. Around him, faces remained hollow and numb beneath the pale emergency lighting. Only 13 survivors remained now. 13 from 42. Lena's empty seat beside the medical station remained untouched. He kept noticing things like that. Empty chairs, silent corridors, missing voices that his brain still expected to hear. The beacon must remain active until final launch, Varric continued. Rescue vessels require signal triangulation through the storms. Ethan nodded automatically, though no one watched him. The beacon. Always the beacon. After the meeting ended, he returned alone to the communications room, where the emergency transmitter pulsed weakly toward orbit through layers of magnetic interference. The machine barely functioned anymore. Half its components had been bypassed manually using scavenged wiring and patched circuitry. Frost covered the outer casing, despite the room heaters struggling at maximum output. Ethan adjusted the frequency regulators carefully while static crackled through the speakers. 3 short pulses. Too long. Repeat. Signal integrity at 32%, Mira observed from behind him. Ethan glanced toward the utility drone hovering near the doorway. Since Lena's death, he had spent more time repairing Mira than almost anything else. Maybe because machines were easier to fix than grief. The AI's damaged voice synthesizer clicked occasionally between words now, but its logic systems had stabilized far beyond original operational parameters. That's still enough, Ethan muttered. Statistically uncertain. Everything here is statistically uncertain. Mira processed that silently for a moment. Observation accepted. Ethan leaned back in the chair and rubbed his eyes. He had not slept properly in weeks. Every time exhaustion dragged him unconscious, he dreamed of white storms swallowing entire hallways while voices called from somewhere beyond the snow. Sometimes, Lena appeared inside those dreams, standing perfectly calm in the middle of the blizzard. Sometimes she simply looked disappointed. He hated those dreams most. You should prepare for departure, Mira said eventually. Ethan stared at the flickering signal display. What about you? The drone paused. Utility support units are not included in evacuation manifests. Ethan laughed once without humor. Of course not. Machines were resources, not survivors. He looked around the room slowly. Everywhere he saw evidence of people who no longer existed. Coffee stains beside abandoned terminals. medical reports left unfinished, handwritten maintenance notes from technicians already buried beneath kilometers of ice outside. The station felt less like a shelter now, and more like a tomb still waiting to close completely. "I can modify your core housing," Ethan said suddenly. "Portable battery pack, compact shell frame. Might fit inside transport storage. That would violate evacuation mass restrictions." "Yeah." Silence settled again between them while the beacon continued transmitting endlessly into nothing. Then warning alarms erupted across the station. Ethan was already moving before the automated voice finished speaking. "Critical structural failure detected. Southern thermal support collapse imminent." The floor trembled violently beneath his boots. Somewhere deep below the station, metal screamed. Ethan sprinted through the corridors while emergency lights flashed red against frozen walls. Personnel rushed past carrying survival gear and diagnostic kits. Another tremor shook the base hard enough to crack ceiling panels overhead. "Generator Sector 3 collapsed," shouted Lieutenant Soren through the comms. "Ice pressure breach, spreading toward habitation modules." Ethan reached the thermal control junction and immediately understood how bad the situation was. One of the primary geothermal stabilizers had ruptured beneath the ice shelf. Superheated steam vented through fractured pipes, while temperatures across the lower station dropped catastrophically. If the support grid failed entirely, entire sections of base Theta would freeze solid within minutes. "We need manual rerouting," Soren barked. "Automated systems are dead." Ethan dropped to the control panel instantly. Then buy me time. For the next 2 hours, the station balanced on the edge of destruction. Ethan crawled through maintenance shafts, flooded with freezing condensation, while generators overloaded around him. Twice he nearly blacked out from oxygen deprivation, repairing ruptured thermal conduits manually. Mira followed closely behind, carrying tools and projecting damaged schematics into the darkness whenever its systems allowed. At one point, an explosion somewhere below sent shockwaves through the entire support structure. Ethan slammed against an ice-covered wall hard enough to crack his visor. "Hull integrity failure spreading," Mira warned. "Survival probability decreasing." Ethan forced himself upright again. "Still not zero." He said it automatically now, a reflex more than optimism. Somehow the rerouting worked. Barely. Enough heat returned to stabilize the remaining habitable sectors. Enough for the evacuation schedule to continue another day. But everyone understood the truth afterward. Base Theta was dying faster than they were. Varike accelerated departure plans immediately. The final launch window would occur within 18 hours during a temporary reduction in atmospheric interference. After that, orbital extraction might become impossible permanently. Ethan spent those remaining hours dismantling everything useful he could salvage from the station. Batteries, heating coils, atmospheric filters. Not because he expected to need them personally, but because leaving equipment behind while others still fought for survival felt wrong somehow. Even now, part of him still believed the station should remain operational for whoever came next. Human thinking, Lena once called it, always planning for tomorrow even while drowning today. Near the end of the cycle, Varric found Ethan alone in the communications room, adjusting the beacon one final time. The commander stood silently for several moments before speaking. "You kept this station alive longer than projections allowed." Ethan shrugged without looking up. "Didn't feel very alive?" Varric studied the patched transmitter array. "The Union will remember your contribution." Ethan almost laughed. Instead, he tightened another cable. "Will the Union remember the people who died here?" Varric did not answer immediately. Outside the communications window, storms rolled endlessly across the frozen plains beneath dark clouds, illuminated by distant lightning. "Command remembers statistics," he said finally. "Individuals are more difficult." Ethan glanced toward him then, seeing exhaustion beneath the commander's rigid control for the first time. Varik looked haunted. "You think this is your fault," Ethan realized quietly. The commander's expression hardened instantly. Survival failure on Cryos 9 was inevitable. "That's not what I asked." Silence stretched between them. Then Varik said, "A commander is responsible for everyone who does not return." Ethan looked back toward the beacon. 3 short pulses. Too long. Repeat. "Then you're carrying too much." Varik left without replying. The evacuation began during artificial dawn cycle, though Cryos 9 itself had no visible sunrise through the storms. Transport shuttles descended from orbit one by one, battling turbulence hard enough to tear smaller craft apart. The surviving crew moved through the corridors in silence, carrying whatever remained of their lives inside thermal packs and equipment crates. No speeches, no optimism, just exhaustion. Ethan helped load the final supply containers while snow hammered against the launch platforms outside. He noticed Mira hovering near the cargo bay entrance, watching the evacuation process quietly. Something twisted uncomfortably inside his chest. "Come here," he called suddenly. The drone floated closer. Ethan opened a maintenance container and began disconnecting portable power cells rapidly. "What are you doing?" Mira asked. "Improvising. Improvisation increases failure probability." Ethan smirked faintly. "Yeah, you mentioned that." Working quickly, he detached the AI's damaged core module and mounted it into a compact emergency housing unit barely larger than a backpack. "Crude, unstable, enough. Portable configuration operational," Mira observed after rebooting. "You really thought I was leaving you here?" The AI paused longer than normal processing time required. "I did not calculate that outcome. Humans are bad at calculations." Alarms interrupted them before Mira could respond. Final launch sequence initiated. All personnel report immediately. Ethan secured the portable housing against his suit harness and followed the remaining survivors toward the transport bay. Wind screamed through partially sealed corridors, while the station groaned around them like something enormous dying beneath the ice. One by one, the survivors boarded the shuttle through the storm. Varik stood near the ramp entrance counting personnel. Personally, "Move quickly," he ordered. Atmospheric conditions destabilizing. Ethan reached the loading ramp just as another tremor shook the platform violently. Somewhere behind them, an entire section of base theta collapsed inward beneath shifting ice pressure. Emergency lights vanished corridor by corridor into darkness. The station was finally losing. Ethan stepped onto the shuttle ramp. Then the beacon died. The sound vanished first. That steady, rhythmic pulse transmitting endlessly through static simply stopped. Ethan froze instantly. Across the bay, emergency systems flickered violently as the communications grid failed completely. "No," he whispered. Varik turned sharply. Ward board immediately. But Ethan was already moving back toward the station interior. The beacon's offline. Leaked. The rescue ships need it. There are no more rescue ships. Ethan ignored him and sprinted into the collapsing station while alarms screamed overhead. Behind him, voices shouted for him to return. He barely heard them. The communications room lay 3 sectors deeper inside the facility, beyond partially collapsed maintenance corridors, filling rapidly with ice fog. Ethan forced himself forward, anyway, lungs burning beneath the survival mask. He reached the transmitter chamber just as emergency power failed entirely. Darkness swallowed the room except for sparks showering from overloaded consoles. The main relay tower had collapsed sideways across the beacon array. Ethan crawled beneath twisted metal, manually reconnecting damaged conduits with frozen fingers while the station died around him. Somewhere distant, another structural collapse thundered through the ice. "Manual bypass complete," Mira reported from his shoulder mount. Ethan slammed the final connector into place. The beacon pulsed alive again. 3 short, 2 long. Repeat. Relief lasted less than 3 seconds. Then the corridor behind him exploded inward. Ice and debris filled the chamber in a roaring avalanche of frozen metal. Ethan hit the ground hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. Pain shot through his shoulder instantly. Emergency lights vanished completely. Silence followed. Total darkness. Ethan pushed himself upright slowly, coughing through the damaged respirator. The corridor entrance no longer existed. Tons of collapsed ice sealed the passage entirely. For several seconds, he simply stared into the darkness, breathing hard. Then, Mira's dim optic sensor illuminated the room faintly blue. "Exit route compromised," the AI said quietly. Ethan looked toward the buried corridor again. Somewhere beyond that wall, the evacuation shuttle was preparing to launch. He imagined Vrick waiting a few extra minutes before departure, maybe 5 if conditions allowed, no longer. Cryos 9 did not forgive hesitation. Ethan sat down slowly beside the still-functioning beacon while storms howled somewhere above the collapsing station. 3 short pulses, too long. Repeat. He listened to the signal for a long time without speaking. Then finally, very softly, he asked, "Mira, yes, Ethan?" He closed his eyes. "Looks like we missed the ride." The first thing Ethan understood after the collapse was that panic wasted oxygen. The second was that Cryos 9 rewarded mistakes with immediate death. He forced himself to remain still in the darkness while Mira projected a dim blue scan across the ruined communications chamber. Ice dust drifted slowly through the air like frozen smoke. Somewhere above, metal groaned beneath unimaginable pressure. "Structural analysis," Ethan whispered through shallow breaths. Mira's damaged processors clicked softly. "Primary corridor inaccessible. Multiple load-bearing failures detected. Estimated excavation time exceeds survivable oxygen duration." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He had expected that answer before asking. Alternative exits? Negative. Silence settled again except for the steady pulse of the beacon beside him. 3 short, 2 long. Repeat. The signal continued transmitting faithfully into the void while the rest of the station died around it. Ethan stared at the blinking lights for several seconds before reality finally settled fully into place. The shuttle was gone. Varick would have delayed departure as long as conditions allowed, but no commander sacrificed an entire evacuation for one engineer trapped beneath collapsing ice. Not on Cryos 9. Maybe especially not on Cryos 9. Ethan should have felt anger then. Instead, he felt only exhaustion. "Current environmental status?" he asked quietly. "External temperatures dropping, internal heating systems failing progressively. Estimated chamber survivability, 6 hours. Ethan nodded once. Enough time to work. Humans were strange creatures that way. Even staring directly at death, part of the brain still searched automatically for problems to solve. He activated his helmet lamp and surveyed the ruined chamber carefully. The beacon array still functioned through emergencies, backup power routed manually before the collapse. Half the room remained intact beneath reinforced communications plating. Storage lockers survived near the far wall. Oxygen canisters too. Not many, but some. "Mira," he said slowly, "show me every remaining power conduit connected to this room." The AI projected a crude schematic across the darkness. Ethan studied it silently, while cold spread steadily through the chamber. The station might be dying, but not all of it was dead yet. Somewhere beneath the ice, geothermal systems still generated residual heat, damaged, fragmented, but alive. A thought formed gradually, irrational, desperate, human. "We're not staying in this room," Ethan decided. Clarify. He stood carefully, despite the pain in his shoulder. "If we can access lower maintenance shafts, we might reach surviving thermal sectors. Probability of successful navigation remains critically low." Ethan grabbed a portable plasma cutter from the storage locker. Still not zero. Mira remained silent for half a second. Observation accepted. The next 18 hours nearly killed him. Ethan carved through collapsed maintenance routes 1 meter at a time, using failing tools and sheer stubbornness, while freezing air poured through fractured walls around him. Twice entire ice sections shifted unexpectedly, forcing him backward through narrow gaps. moments before collapse. Oxygen levels dropped steadily. His injured shoulder stiffened until moving the cutter became agony. More than once, he considered simply sitting down beside the beacon and letting the cold finish the work for him. Then he remembered Lena's voice. Keep transmitting. So he kept moving. Eventually, the maintenance shaft opened into darkness below the communications sector. Ethan climbed downward through ruined infrastructure, buried deep beneath base Theta. The lower levels felt different. Warmer. Not warm enough to survive comfortably, but enough to prevent immediate freezing. Geothermal runoff still flowed through parts of the old reactor grid, small pockets of life hidden beneath kilometers of ice and wreckage. Thermal readings stabilizing, Mira reported. Ethan nearly laughed from relief. The abandoned sectors beneath base Theta became his world after that. Not because they were safe. Nothing on Cryos 9 was safe, but they were survivable with work. Endless work. The first weeks blurred together in cycles of repair and exhaustion. Ethan converted an old maintenance junction into a crude shelter using insulated hull plating scavenged from collapsed corridors. He rerouted geothermal pipes manually to create minimal heat circulation. He dismantled emergency storage units for batteries, filtration membranes, ration packs, tools, wiring, anything useful. Every day became a calculation against death, heat, oxygen, food, power, repeat. At first, he still believed rescue might return. He maintained strict schedules, logged survival reports daily, monitored orbital frequencies constantly for signs of Union traffic. The beacon transmitted every hour without fail, 3 short, 2 long, repeat, but days passed, then weeks, then months. Nothing answered except static. Cryos 9 swallowed sound itself eventually. During the 3rd month, Ethan ran out of standard food supplies. He solved the problem the way humans always solved impossible problems. Badly at first. "This is a terrible idea," he muttered while lowering a sensor line into a geothermal fracture beneath the ice tunnels. "Nutritional alternatives are limited," Mira replied. The scanner had detected microbial activity deep below the frozen crust. Primitive extremophile organisms clustered around thermal vents where geothermal heat touched liquid water beneath the glaciers. Alien science teams originally classified them as non-viable for consumption. Ethan ignored that classification because starvation simplified risk assessment dramatically. Harvesting the organisms nearly killed him twice. The thermal fractures were unstable labyrinths of boiling water trapped beneath frozen ceilings thinner than glass in places. One mistake meant falling into sub-zero oceans beneath the ice shelf with no rescue possible. But the microbes contained usable proteins after chemical filtration. Disgusting, bitter, barely edible, enough. Human survival thresholds continue exceeding projections, Mira observed after Ethan consumed the processed biomass without dying immediately. Ethan wiped frozen residue from his mouth. "Trust me, this isn't survival. This is losing slower." Yet his body adapted anyway. Human metabolism adjusted gradually to the poisoned air and miserable nutrition. His muscles hardened from constant labor. Scars accumulated across his hands from burns, frostbite, and shattered machinery. Sleep shortened into restless 4-hour cycles, interrupted constantly by alarms or storms. The shelter evolved with him. What began as a maintenance junction slowly transformed into something closer to a buried fortress. Ethan expanded insulated tunnels through the lower station ruins. He constructed algae tanks using old hydroponic membranes and geothermal heat. He repaired damaged atmospheric recyclers piece by piece until oxygen quality stabilized marginally above lethal levels. Everywhere inside the shelter, evidence of improvisation accumulated. Pipes welded from engine conduits, furniture built from cargo crates, walls layered with thermal blankets and scavenged plating. None of it looked elegant. All it worked, barely. Mira changed too. At first, the AI remained little more than a damaged utility system following programmed support routines, but isolation altered both of them over time. Ethan talked constantly while working because silence became dangerous. After enough months alone, he explained repairs allowed, complained about the cold, told stories about Earth nobody else remained alive to remember. Mira listened, then eventually responded. You repeat certain memories frequently. The AI observed one cycle while Ethan repaired filtration valves. Yeah? Particularly references involving rain. Ethan paused briefly. Guess I miss weather that doesn't want me dead. Myra processed that. Cryos 9 weather patterns demonstrate no intentional hostility. Ethan snorted softly. Spend another year here, and you'll change your mind. Another pause. Then, surprisingly, Mira answered, observation statistically plausible. Ethan stared at the drone for several seconds before laughing for the first time in months. Real laughter. It hurt his chest physically because he'd forgotten the sensation. After that, things shifted subtly between them. Ethan began teaching the AI human concepts, mostly to preserve his own sanity, humor, music, games. He found an old chess program buried inside station archives and spent entire storm cycles playing against Mira beside the geothermal heaters while winds screamed beyond the ice walls. The AI learned rapidly, too rapidly. You cheated. Ethan accused after losing 6 matches consecutively. Negative. You consistently sacrificed defensive positioning for emotional, tactical maneuvers. Ethan pointed accusingly at the board. That sentence alone proves you cheated. Mira's optic lens brightened slightly, almost amused. Humor detected. Isolation still carved pieces away from him regardless. Some mornings, Ethan woke forgetting briefly where he was. Others, he heard voices in distant corridors, only to realize the sounds were shifting ice and failing pipes. Once he turned suddenly, after hearing Lena laugh behind him near the algae tanks. No one stood there. He remained frozen for almost a minute afterwards, staring into empty air. Cryos 9 attacked the mind as patiently as the body. To fight that, Ethan created rituals. Human rituals. He maintained a calendar scratched manually into the shelter wall even after losing certainty about exact dates. Every evening he prepared 2 meal portions instead of one for himself. One placed silently across the table where Lena once sat. Ridiculous maybe, but necessary. You continue allocating resources inefficiently. Myra observed during one evening cycle while Ethan placed the untouched second bowl onto the table again. Yeah, clarify purpose. Ethan sat heavily into the chair across from the empty seat. Steam rose faintly from recycled nutrient broth between them. For several seconds, he simply stared at the second bowl. If I stop doing this, he said quietly, then they're really gone. Mira processed the statement silently. The deceased remained biologically absent regardless of ritual continuation. Ethan smiled faintly without humor. That's the most robot thing you've ever said. Correction acknowledged? Silence returned. Outside, distant ice quakes rumbled through the glacier foundations. Ethan picked up his spoon slowly. Humans need routines, he said eventually. We build habits so the world makes sense. Birthdays, holidays, dinner tables, dumb little things. Even in isolation, Ethan looked toward the storm walls surrounding the shelter. Especially in isolation. Mira's optic sensor focused on the empty chair across from Ethan. Then the ritual preserved psychological stability. Ethan nodded once. Something like that? The AI paused. Would you like me to occupy the second position during meals? Ethan stared at the drone in surprise. Then very slowly he smiled. Yeah, he said softly. I think I would. Years passed after that. Real years. Not survivable stretches measured in emergency cycles anymore, but entire sections of life consumed beneath the frozen world. Ethan stopped tracking exact dates after the 3rd year because the numbers no longer mattered. Survival became existence itself. The shelter expanded steadily into the buried ruins of Base Theta while the station above collapsed deeper beneath migrating glaciers. Entire corridors vanished under ice pressure. Others froze solid permanently. Ethan adapted constantly, relocating systems, rebuilding infrastructure. chasing geothermal heat pockets deeper underground whenever old sectors died. He became something Cryos 9 had never expected, a permanent resident. The planet still tried killing him every day. It simply stopped succeeding. Then came the great whiteout. Mira detected the storm formation first. Atmospheric readings abnormal. The AI warned while Ethan repaired external thermal relays near the surface access tunnels. Ethan checked the scanners and felt cold settle somewhere deeper than the environment itself. The storm system spreading across the hemisphere dwarfed every previous formation recorded since the expedition arrival. Wind projections exceeded structural tolerance estimates for all remaining surface sectors. "How long?" he asked. "Initial impact within 4 hours." Ethan immediately began emergency reinforcement procedures: exterior shield plating, generator stabilization, oxygen reserve sealing. But even while working, he understood the truth already. Nothing built by human hands was designed to survive what approached. The storm hit during artificial night cycle. The world ended above the shelter. Wind impacts shook the underground structure continuously like orbital bombardment. Entire tunnel sections collapsed within the first hour. Surface access shafts imploded beneath ice pressure. Emergency power fluctuated violently while geothermal regulators overloaded from thermal shock. Ethan spent nearly 18 consecutive hours fighting system failures manually while exhaustion blurred his vision. Generator 3 offline, restarting, pressure breach in eastern tunnel, seal it, oxygen purity declining. I know. At some point during the chaos, an exterior support tower collapsed directly into the main thermal grid. The explosion threw Ethan across the maintenance chamber hard enough to crack 2 ribs. He regained consciousness lying on frozen metal while emergency alarms screamed overhead. Mira hovered beside him frantically. "Internal temperature collapse. Imminent," the AI warned. Ethan forced himself upright through blinding pain. "How long?" "Estimated survivability without repairs." 41 minutes. Ethan laughed weakly through blood and exhaustion. Optimistic. Then he grabbed his thermal gear and staggered toward the surface airlock. "External conditions exceed survival thresholds," Mira said immediately. "Yeah," Ethan answered while sealing the damaged helmet. "That's been true for years." The moment the outer hatch opened, the storm nearly killed him instantly. Wind slammed into Ethan hard enough to knock him sideways against the ice wall. Visibility vanished completely beneath swirling white violence. The world became nothing except cold and force and noise. He crawled toward the collapsed thermal tower by memory more than sight while suit alarms screamed continuously in his ears. Ice particles struck exposed surfaces like bullets. Twice he lost orientation entirely. Once he nearly walked directly over a fractured crevasse hidden beneath fresh snow. Somehow he reached the damaged grid. The repair itself took less than 7 minutes. Surviving those 7 minutes almost proved impossible. Ethan's gloves froze partially to exposed metal while reconnecting power conduits manually. His left leg stopped responding correctly halfway through the procedure due to cold exposure. Oxygen warnings flashed critical across his visor. Then finally the generators roared back online beneath the ice. Heat returned to the shelter systems. Ethan stared at the restored power readings through half-frozen vision and managed a weak smile. Then the storm shifted. Somewhere inside the white chaos, a distant signal tone crackled across his comm receiver. Ethan froze instantly. He thought at first it was hallucination from hypothermia. Then the signal repeated, faint, broken by interference, but real. He stumbled backward through the blizzard, listening in disbelief, while static hissed through the damaged comm unit. Mira's voice cut sharply into his headset. Unknown transmission detected. Ethan's heart pounded painfully against frozen ribs. Origin? Static answered first. Then slowly, impossibly, words emerged beneath the storm. "Any surviving personnel?" Respond. Ethan stopped breathing for half a second. Somewhere above Cryos 9, after years of silence, someone was finally listening. Captain Varric stood motionless on the bridge of the Vindicator while Cryos 9 rotated slowly beneath the forward observation glass like a frozen eye staring back at him through darkness. 10 years had changed the planet very little. Storm systems still churned endlessly across the surface. Lightning still crawled through the atmosphere in vast electric scars visible from orbit. Even from space, the world radiated hostility. The bridge crew remained unusually quiet around him. Most of them were young enough to know Cryos 9 only through archived disaster reports and survival case studies taught in military academies. To them, the planet was mythology wrapped in statistics. To Varric, it was memory. "Repeat the transmission," he ordered. A comm officer obeyed immediately. Static flooded the bridge speakers first. Then the signal emerged beneath the interference. 3 short pulses. Pause. Too long. Pause. Repeat. Human emergency cadence. Ancient. Primitive. Impossible. The rhythm itself disturbed Varric more than the signal strength. Automated beacons transmitted with mathematical precision. This one did not. Tiny inconsistencies existed between intervals. Delays measured in fractions of seconds. Human delays. Fatigue. Breathing. Someone was still pressing the relay manually after 10 years inside a dead world. "Signal origin confirmed?" Varric asked. "Affirmative," replied Navigation Officer Tarev. "Subsurface source beneath former base theta coordinates." Another silence settled across the bridge. Everyone there understood what that meant. Base theta no longer officially existed. Orbital scans years earlier showed the entire region buried beneath migrating glaciers nearly 3 kilometers thick. Nothing should have survived under that pressure. "Captain," Tarev said carefully, "there remains a significant probability the transmission originates from malfunctioning archival systems." Varric looked toward the planet again. "No," the officer hesitated. "Respectfully, sir, machines repeat patterns," Varric interrupted quietly. "This signal persists." No one argued after that. They all heard it too. The subtle irregularity hidden beneath the static, a living rhythm. The Vindicator had not come to Cryos 9 officially. Fleet Command denied authorization for surface operations weeks earlier after Varric submitted his investigation request. The Senate considered the matter resolved already. Arcturus casualties were closed historical records. Cryos 9 remained quarantined. Yet Varric returned anyway using old military privileges and a skeleton volunteer crew willing to risk disciplinary action alongside him. Some came out of loyalty, others curiosity. A few simply wanted to witness the impossible personally atmospheric. Interference worsening, Tarev warned. Surface insertion windows remain extremely narrow. Varric nodded once. "Prepare reconnaissance descent." Several officers exchanged uneasy glances. "Sir," one finally said, "if condition destabilized during atmospheric entry, I know the risks." His tone ended the discussion instantly. Deep beneath the ice, Ethan listened to the transmission repeat across damaged speakers inside his shelter, while his hands shook uncontrollably from exhaustion and disbelief. Static distorted most of the message, but one fact mattered more than the words themselves. Someone was there. For several minutes, he simply sat beside the communications console, staring at nothing while the reality tried fitting inside his mind. Rescue, the concept felt alien now, unreal, like remembering a childhood story after forgetting the language it was told in. Mira hovered silently nearby, optic sensor focused on the signal receiver. Transmission source matches orbital vector patterns, the AI confirmed. Ethan laughed weakly. "You're telling me there's actually a ship up there?" "Evidence supports that conclusion." He leaned back slowly against the shelter wall. Every muscle in his body ached after surviving the Great White Wall. Half the thermal systems still required repair. His left leg remained partially numb from cold exposure. Yet none of it felt fully real anymore because somewhere above other storms, another human voice had finally touched the silence. Then the comm receiver crackled again. Surviving personnel identify. Ethan froze. The voice was distorted almost beyond recognition beneath magnetic interference, but it was undeniably alien. Calm, military, familiar somehow. This is. Static swallowed the next words entirely. Respond if able. Ethan stared at the microphone beside the beacon console for a long moment. His hand hovered above it uncertainly. 10 years of silence conditioned part of him to distrust hope itself. What if this was another hallucination, another psychological fracture born from isolation and exhaustion? Cryos 9 had taught him the mind could betray itself as easily as machinery. "Ethan?" Mira said quietly. "The transmission awaits response." He swallowed hard, then slowly picked up the microphone. "This is." His voice cracked immediately from disuse. Ethan blinked in surprise. He had not spoken loudly in years. He cleared his throat painfully and tried again. "This is Ethan Ward, Arcturus Engineering Division." Silence followed. Static hissed across the speakers endlessly. Ethan's heartbeat pounded louder than the storm outside. Then suddenly the comm system exploded with overlapping voices. "Repeat identification. Signal confirmed. By the stars." Ethan closed his eyes briefly as emotion hit him harder than expected. Real voices, not memories, not dreams, real. Then one final voice cut through the chaos, calm, controlled. "Ethan Ward." Ethan opened his eyes instantly. He recognized that voice even after 10 years. "Captain?" Silence stretched for half a second. Then Varric answered softly, "You survived." Ethan almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. Apparently, no one aboard the Vindicator spoke for several seconds after hearing the response. Even hardened military personnel stared at their consoles in open disbelief. The human voice sounded rough, exhausted, older than the personnel file recordings archived from the Arcturus mission. But it existed. Against every law of probability, it existed. Varric remained standing motionless beside the bridge viewport while static crackled through the comm channel between him and the planet below. He remembered Ethan as a quiet maintenance worker who avoided command briefings whenever possible. Forgettable, ordinary. Yet now that same human had survived alone on Cryos 9 longer than any recorded multi-species expedition in Union history. "What is your current condition?" Varric asked carefully. Ethan considered the question somewhere far below the ice. He glanced around the shelter automatically. Patched walls, leaking pipes, algae tanks, bubbling beside salvage generators, endless scars of survival welded into every surface. "Complicated," he answered finally. Several crew members on the bridge laughed nervously from sheer disbelief. Varric did not. "Can you reach the surface?" "Depends how much the planet hates me today." Another brief silence followed. Then unexpectedly, one of the younger officers near tactical muttered, "He jokes." Varric heard the astonishment in the statement. So did everyone else. Ethan sounded tired, scarred, but not broken. That unsettled them almost more than the survival itself. "Surface extraction remains hazardous," Varric said. "Atmospheric conditions are deteriorating rapidly." "Yeah," Ethan replied. "That sounds like Cryos 9. The human had adapted so completely to the planet that catastrophe sounded routine now. The realization disturbed Varric deeply. "We are dispatching reconnaissance teams," he continued. "Transmit your exact location coordinates." Ethan pulled up the old station map slowly. Base Theta lower maintenance sectors. Most upper levels collapsed years ago. "Years?" Ethan snorted softly. "You lose track after a while." A young science officer aboard the Vindicator leaned toward her console, whispering calculations under her breath. "Captain," she said, finally, "the geothermal infrastructure he described should not remain operational." Ethan heard her through the open comm channel. "It doesn't," he replied. "Not unless I keep fixing it." Silence again. No one knew how to respond to that. Eventually, Varric spoke. "Maintain current position. We are descending immediately." Ethan almost said okay automatically. Then he stopped himself. "Captain?" "Yes?" Ethan stared at the beacon pulsing beside him. 3 short, 2 long. Repeat. You actually came back." Varric looked down at the frozen world beneath the ship. "Yes," he answered quietly. "I did." The first descent team launched less than an hour later. 3 armored atmospheric shuttles dropped through Cryos 9 storm layers, carrying rescue personnel, engineers, and scientific observers despite every safety protocol warning against it. Varric personally commanded the operation from the Liad shuttle. No one tried convincing him otherwise. The atmosphere attacked them immediately. Turbulence hammered the shuttle hull hard enough to trigger structural alarms within minutes. Electromagnetic interference distorted navigation constantly while white storms swallowed visibility beyond the cockpit glass. "Stabilizers fluctuating," warned the pilot. "We may lose guidance lock below cloud layer." Varric remained perfectly still in his harness. Continued descent. Beside him, Dr. Selvig reviewed Ethan's survival records repeatedly on a portable screen, as though hoping the numbers would eventually become logical. 10 years, she muttered. "Human physiology alone cannot explain this." Varric watched lightning crawl across the storm clouds outside. "No," he agreed quietly, "it cannot." Meanwhile, beneath the ice, Ethan prepared for visitors like a man expecting ghosts. He moved through the shelter, mechanically cleaning workstations and reorganizing supply crates, though none of it truly mattered. The place looked less like a home and more like a machine built by desperation over thousands of days. Scars covered every wall. Half the systems existed only because Ethan refused allowing them to die. "Your stress indicators are elevated," Mira observed. Ethan glanced toward the drone while tightening loose conduit wiring. "There are people coming here. That outcome was previously desired." "Yeah." He stopped working, briefly. "Doesn't make it less weird." Mira processed silently for a moment. Clarify emotional instability. Ethan leaned against the console slowly. How could he explain it? For 10 years, survival had been simple in a brutal way. Every day contained immediate goals: heat, oxygen, repairs, food, continue existing. The possibility of rescue changed everything instantly. Suddenly, tomorrow existed again. Suddenly, the universe outside Cryos 9 mattered. That terrified him more than the storm sometimes. "What if I don't fit out there anymore?" he asked quietly. Mira's optic sensor focused on him. "You maintained human behavioral rituals continuously throughout isolation." Ethan laughed faintly. "Eating dinner beside a robot isn't exactly normal civilization." "Correction," Mira answered. "You ate dinner beside a friend." Ethan froze slightly. The AI continued before he could answer. "Humans assign emotional significance through persistent social bonds, regardless of biological classification." Another pause. "You taught me that." Ethan looked away quickly then, because something tightened painfully in his chest. Before he could respond, the shelter trembled violently beneath a distant impact. Snow and ice dust rained from the ceiling. Mira's sensors brightened immediately. Atmospheric entry signatures detected. Ethan's heart began pounding harder. They were here, really here. He moved toward the surface access tunnel almost automatically, climbing through the narrow geothermal corridors he had expanded over years of survival. The ascent took nearly 20 minutes. By the time he reached the outer observation shaft, his breathing had grown uneven despite the supplemental oxygen. Not from exhaustion, from fear. Through layers of storm and snow, faint lights moved across the surface above. Shuttle engines, search beams, rescue teams walking across Cryos 9 for the first time in a decade. Ethan stared upward through the ice-covered observation slit, while memories crashed through him unexpectedly. The Arcturus landing, Lena laughing in the maintenance corridors, Varric giving survival briefings before everything collapsed. It felt like another lifetime belonging to someone else entirely. "Thermal signatures approaching," Mira reported quietly. Ethan adjusted the external cameras toward the surface access ridge. Shapes emerged slowly through the blizzard. Armored figures moving cautiously between ice formations, while storm winds hammered their suits. One stopped near the collapsed remains of Base Theta's upper sectors and stared silently at the ruins buried beneath kilometers of snow. Varik. Ethan recognized the posture instantly, even through the armor. The captain looked older now, slower somehow, but unmistakably the same. The rescue teams advanced carefully toward the geothermal access tunnel Ethan transmitted earlier. Searchlights swept across improvised structures protruding from the ice. Patched ventilation towers, scavenged thermal piping, antenna arrays welded manually from station debris. Evidence of survival everywhere. These systems are active, one rescuer said through open comms, disbelief obvious in her voice. Some recently repaired. Another found an exterior maintenance hatch reinforced repeatedly with mismatched metal plating over years of storm damage. Who built all this? Silence answered briefly. Then Ethan's voice crackled through their helmets from below the ice, mostly panic and bad decisions. Several rescue personnel jumped visibly at hearing him so close. Varik stepped toward the hatch slowly while snow spiraled around the team beneath floodlights and storm lightning. "Ethan Ward," he said into the comm channel, "can you reach the surface access point?" A pause followed, then Ethan answered, "Yeah." Another pause. "Probably." Against all logic, several members of the rescue team laughed out loud, not because the situation was funny, but because tension needed somewhere to go. Varik remained silent while staring at the reinforced hatch beneath the storm. Somewhere below his feet, one ordinary human had survived 10 years inside the deadliest environment the Union had ever recorded. And for the first time since returning to Cryos 9, Varik realized something unsettling. The planet had not merely failed to kill Ethan Ward. In some impossible way, the human had learned how to live there. The hatch opened slowly beneath layers of ice pressure and shrieking wind. Rescue floodlights cut through the storm in pale beams while steam rose from the geothermal tunnels below. For several seconds, no one emerged. Then a figure climbed upward from the darkness, one careful step at a time. The storm hit Ethan immediately, whipping torn thermal fabric against his body while ice crystals scattered across his helmet visor. He stopped near the surface ridge and stared silently at the rescue team surrounding the entrance. No one moved. The moment felt strangely unreal for both sides. The legends aboard the Vindicator described Cryos 9 as a death world where entire expeditions vanished in weeks. Yet standing before them now was a single exhausted human who looked less like her and more like part of the planet itself. Ethan's survival suit had been repaired so many times it no longer resembled standard Union equipment. Different metals patched the outer layers unevenly. One shoulder plate came from mining armor. The oxygen pack was visibly rebuilt by hand. Frost scars crossed the exposed portions of his face where the visor seals no longer fully closed. His beard had gone partially gray. One eye carried permanent blood vessel damage from years of cold exposure. Yet, despite all of that, he remained standing. "Captain," Ethan said quietly through the wind. Varik stared at him for a long moment before answering. "Engineer Ward." Ethan smiled faintly. Still weird hearing that again. One of the younger rescue officers whispered something under his breath in disbelief. Ethan noticed immediately. After 10 years of isolation, he had become dangerously observant. "You guys look warmer than I remember," he said dryly. Nervous laughter spread through the team almost instantly. The tension broke just enough for movement to resume. Medical personnel approached Ethan carefully with portable scanners, while engineers began stabilizing the surface tunnel entrance. Mira floated upward from the geothermal shaft behind Ethan, optic sensor glowing through the storm. Several officers flinched instinctively at the sight of the damaged drone. "Utility AI unit active," someone reported. "Extensive modifications detected." "Yeah," Ethan replied. "She complains a lot, but she's useful." "Observation inaccurate," Mira answered immediately. Several rescue personnel exchanged startled looks. The drone's conversational patterns exceeded standard support AI behavior significantly. Ethan noticed their reactions and shrugged. Long winters. Varric stepped closer while medics scanned Ethan's vitals. The readings triggered immediate alarm indicators across their portable systems. "Captain," one medic said carefully, "his condition is unstable, severe tissue damage, chronic respiratory scarring, multiple untreated fractures." Ethan glanced toward the scanner. "That seems dramatic." "You should not be ambulatory." "Yeah," Ethan answered. "Cryos 9 says that a lot too." Again, the rescue team found themselves laughing, despite the horror buried beneath the statement. Varric did not laugh. He studied Ethan's face carefully beneath the storm lights. There was something deeply unsettling about the human now. Not physically, spiritually almost. 10 years earlier, Ethan Ward had been an ordinary maintenance worker. Quiet, slightly awkward, forgettable. The man standing before him now possessed the stillness of something that had endured too much for too long. Not broken, hardened, like ice under pressure. "We need immediate extraction," Varric said finally. "Atmospheric conditions are deteriorating." Ethan looked toward the horizon automatically. Vast storm walls rolled across the plains beneath distant lightning flashes. "Yeah," he murmured, "that one's bad." A rescue pilot checked incoming weather telemetry and cursed softly. "Captain, the storm front accelerated. We've lost half our safe ascent window already." Varric turned toward the shuttles. "Begin evacuation procedures immediately." The problem revealed itself 3 minutes later. Main guidance array offline. An engineer shouted over the comms. Storm interference overloaded the landing beacon. Every rescue shuttle depended on the surface guidance tower for ascent trajectory calculations through Cryos 9's magnetic storms. Without it, takeoff during full atmospheric instability bordered on suicide. One pilot ran emergency diagnostics while snow hammered the hull around him. "Backup navigation won't survive the interference field," he warned. "We lose the beacon, we lose orbital lock." Ethan's expression changed instantly. "Where's the relay?" "North Ridge Communications Mast," replied the engineer. "About 600 meters." Ethan looked toward the storm automatically. The communications mast stood barely visible through the white chaos atop a ridge of ice formations, half buried by drifting snow. Even from there, he could see the damage. The upper antenna array had collapsed sideways beneath the wind. "Can it be repaired remotely?" Varric asked. "Negative," the engineer answered. "Manual realignment required." Silence followed. Everyone understood what that meant. The storm outside had intensified beyond standard survival limits already. Visibility was collapsing. Wind strong enough to rip armored personnel off. Exposed ridges screamed across the surface. Any repair attempt out there would be nearly impossible. Ethan began walking toward the equipment crates before anyone spoke. Varric stopped him immediately. "No." Ethan turned slowly. "The shuttles need the relay. Your physical condition is unacceptable for external exposure." Ethan glanced toward the storm again. "I know this planet better than your team does. That is precisely why you are not going back into it." Ethan almost smiled at that. "Captain, with respect, Cryos 9 stopped asking what's acceptable a long time ago." Another violent gust shook the ridge hard enough to stagger several rescue personnel. The communications mast sparked again through the blizzard. One of the pilots cursed loudly over the comms. "We're losing stabilization fast." Varric looked between the storm and Ethan while calculations moved silently behind his eyes. Ethan saw the moment the commander understood the truth. No one else there had the experience necessary to survive that walk. Not in time. "I can guide him," Mira said suddenly. All eyes shifted toward the drone hovering beside Ethan. "My terrain records contain 10 years of surface adaptation data." Ethan grabbed a replacement thermal cable from the supply crate. "See? Teamwork." Varric stepped closer, voice lower now beneath the wind. "You owe this planet nothing anymore." Ethan paused at that. For several seconds, he simply stared out across the white wasteland surrounding them. Then quietly, he answered, "That's not why I'm doing it." Varric said nothing. Ethan secured the repair kit across his damaged suit while rescue personnel watched him with expressions somewhere between admiration and disbelief. One young officer finally asked the question everyone else avoided. "How did you survive here this long?" Ethan adjusted his cracked gloves slowly. "Routine, mostly." The officer frowned slightly. Ethan looked toward the storm again. "You wake up, something breaks, you fix it, then you do it again tomorrow." He shrugged faintly. After a while, the impossible just becomes normal. No one knew how to answer that. The storm swallowed Ethan almost immediately after he left the ridge. One moment his silhouette remained visible beneath the floodlights. The next, the white chaos consumed everything beyond a few meters. Wind roared constantly across the comm channels while Mira projected navigation guidance into Ethan's visor. 40 meters to ridge incline, the AI reported. Ethan pushed forward through waist-deep snow while the storm to him tried physically tearing him sideways. Every breath burned through damaged lungs. The cold bit instantly through weakened suit insulation. He had survived storms like this before, but never after the great whiteout injuries. His body felt slower now, older. "Biometric stress rising," Mira warned. "Yeah," Ethan muttered through clenched teeth. "Join the club." The climb grew steeper near the communications ridge. Ice formation shifted unpredictably beneath fresh snowfall while visibility dropped almost entirely. Twice, Ethan lost footing and slid dangerously close to buried crevasses hidden beneath the storm. Once he stopped entirely after hearing something impossible through the wind. Laughter, Lena's laughter. Ethan closed his eyes hard beneath the visor. Hallucinations again. Hypothermia pulling old ghosts from memory. Cognitive irregularity detected, Mira observed carefully. Ethan forced himself moving again. Still here.
Affirmative.
The relay tower emerged gradually from the storm ahead. Half clopposite, buried in ice. Electrical arcs snapped wildly from damaged antenna sections above. Ethan reached the base platform and nearly fell climbing the frozen maintenance ladder. Every movement hurt now. His injured ribs screamed beneath the suit pressure harness. Relay alignment impossible without exterior access, Mira reported. Ethan looked upward toward the broken antenna assembly swaying violently in the wind 30 meters above the ridge. "Of course it is." He began climbing. The tower shook continuously beneath storm impact while ice coated every surface. Ethan climbed slowly using one numb hand at a time while the planet screamed around him. Halfway up, the safety line snapped loose from the support rail. Ethan slammed sideways into the tower hard enough to nearly lose grip entirely. "Ethan!" Mira said sharply. He breathed hard for several seconds before answering. Still not zero. The AI fell silent after that because it recognized the statement for what it truly was now. Not optimism. Discipline. Ethan finally reached the damaged antenna platform near the tower summit. The relay assembly had twisted nearly 40 degrees off axis beneath storm pressure. Guidance signals scattered uselessly into the atmosphere instead of maintaining orbital lock. Ethan secured himself against the platform with frozen cables and began manual realignment procedures while wind tried ripping the tools from his hands. Below, the rescue teams tracked his progress through fragmented telemetry. One pilot whispered quietly, "He's actually doing it." Varric stood beside the shuttle watching Ethan's barely visible silhouette against the storm. "Humans endure," he said softly. "That is what they do." Up on the tower, Ethan's fingers lost sensation completely halfway through the repairs. He continued working anyway, through muscle memory and stubbornness alone. Ice formed across the inside of his visor from freezing breath condensation. Warning alarms flashed critical across every system display. "Core temperature collapse imminent," Mira warned. Ethan tightened the final alignment brace manually. "Then let's hurry." Another gust hit the tower, hard enough to bend the upper supports. Ethan nearly blacked out from the impact. Memories blurred suddenly through his mind. Earth rain against apartment windows. Lena sitting beside the infirmary heater, smiling faintly through exhaustion. Mira learning chess in the underground shelter. Endless dinners beside an empty chair. 10 years compressed into fragments beneath the storm. Ethan, Mira said more softly now, "Why did you continue transmitting the beacon?" Ethan adjusted the final relay lock slowly. "What? You stated previously that rescue expectation probability became negligible years ago." He paused. The storm screamed around him endlessly. Somewhere below, rescue shuttles waited in darkness. "Because hope's a discipline," Ethan answered quietly. "You practice it every day or you lose it." Mira processed the statement silently. Ethan secured the final connector. Instantly, the damaged relay array stabilized overhead. Guidance signals surged back online. Below the ridge, rescue shuttles roared louder as navigation systems re-established orbital lock through the storm. Cheers erupted across the comm channels. Ethan smiled weakly against the frozen visor. Then, the tower support beneath him cracked. Metal screamed violently. Ethan looked downward just as the upper platform sheared sideways beneath the storm pressure. The world vanished into white motion. He remembered falling, then cold. Endless cold, swallowing everything. Distantly, he heard voices shouting through calm interference while snow buried him beneath the ridge. For several seconds, nothing existed except exhaustion deeper than pain itself. Maybe this was finally it. Cryos 9 collecting its debt after all. Then another voice cut through the darkness. Lena's voice. "Keep transmitting." Ethan opened his eyes weakly. Beneath layers of snow, somewhere above the storm, shuttle engines thundered through the atmosphere. Smira's optic light flickered nearby through the ice. "Ethan," the AI called urgently. He coughed hard and tasted blood inside the respirator. "Still here," he whispered. Moments later, rescue personnel reached him through the blizzard. Hands pulled him upward from the snow while voices shouted medical instructions across the comms. Ethan barely registered any of it. His vision blurred in and out beneath floodlights and storm shadows as they carried him toward the shuttle. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness finally claimed him was Cryos 9 disappearing behind white storms while the rescue ship engines ignited against the darkness. Warmth hurt more than the cold. Ethan realized that before he fully woke. Pain spread through his body in slow waves as sensation returned to nerves damaged by years of freezing temperatures and the final storm on Cryos 9. He drifted upward through darkness gradually, consciousness surfacing in fragments. Distant machinery humming softly, muted voices somewhere nearby, the unfamiliar sensation of clean, filtered air. No wind, no ice pressure groaning through walls. No alarms screaming in the background. For the first time in 10 years, the universe sounded quiet. Ethan opened his eyes slowly against painfully bright lights overhead. The ceiling above him was smooth white alloy instead of patched metal and exposed thermal piping. Medical equipment blinked steadily beside the bed. Heated air moved gently across his skin. Real heat. Not the desperate recycled warmth of geothermal generators barely holding back death. Real warmth. For several seconds, he simply stared upward without moving because part of his mind still expected the illusion to disappear. "He's awake," someone said quietly nearby. Ethan turned his head slightly and immediately regretted it as pain stabbed through his ribs and neck. A medical officer approached beside the bed while scanners adjusted automatically around him. Behind her, large reinforced windows revealed deep space beyond the ship hull. Stars. Ethan stared at them silently. He had forgotten how many existed. "Easy," the medic said carefully. "You've been unconscious for 32 hours. Ethan tried speaking. His throat felt shredded raw. "Water," he managed finally. The medic handed him a hydration tube immediately. Ethan drank slowly while his eyes remained fixed on the stars outside. They looked wrong somehow. Too open, too infinite. After a decade beneath ice and stone, the sheer emptiness of space unsettled him. "You're aboard the Vindicator," the medic explained. "We successfully cleared Cryos 9 atmosphere 6 hours ago." Ethan closed his eyes briefly at that. Gone, the word felt impossible. Cryos 9 had consumed so much of his existence that leaving it behind almost resembled losing gravity itself. Mira, he asked immediately. "Operational," another voice answered from the doorway. Ethan looked up as the damaged drone floated slowly into the medical chamber. Fresh repair plating covered sections of the AI's housing now, though much of the original damage remained intentionally untouched. "Your survival probability increased substantially after extraction," Mira observed. Ethan smiled faintly despite the pain. "Good to know." The medic checked another scanner reading and frowned slightly. "You should not be conscious yet." Ethan leaned his head back against the pillow slowly. "Yeah," he murmured. "People keep saying that." Over the next several days, the Vindicator medical staff discovered something both fascinating and disturbing. Ethan Ward should have died hundreds of times. His chronic cold exposure scarred nearly every major organ system. His lungs carried permanent crystalline damage from Cryos 9's atmosphere. Bones had healed incorrectly after untreated fractures. Muscular degeneration from long-term nutritional deficiency existed alongside bizarre physiological adaptations no union doctors fully understood. His body had not survived the planet cleanly. It had survived violently, by adapting faster than it broke. Dr. Selvig spent hours reviewing his scans in stunned silence. "Human resilience thresholds are completely misclassified," she muttered during one examination while Ethan sat wrapped in heated blankets beside the observation window. Ethan watched stars drift slowly beyond the glass. "You should see human fast food." Selvig almost smiled before the seriousness returned. No species should have endured that environment alone. Ethan shrugged slightly. "Wasn't alone." Myra floated beside the bed immediately as if responding to an invisible cue. Selvig studied the AI curiously. "The drone's behavioral evolution is extraordinary. That's one word for it," Ethan answered. "You altered its core architecture extensively." Ethan looked toward Myra for a moment. "I talked to her. Conversation alone cannot produce this level of adaptive development." Ethan smiled faintly again. "You'd be surprised what loneliness can do." Outside the medical ward, news of Ethan's survival spread through the Vindicator faster than any official announcement could contain it. Crew members invented reasons to pass near the recovery deck, hoping to glimpse the human from Cryos 9. Scientists requested interviews. Military personnel reviewed his survival logs obsessively. Rumors expanded with every retelling. Some described Ethan as a genius engineer who built underground cities beneath the ice. Others claimed humans possessed dormant biological traits activated only under extreme stress. One particularly absurd theory suggested Cryos 9 itself had altered him somehow. The truth disappointed them slightly. Ethan Ward remained painfully ordinary. Quiet, tired, awkward around attention. Yet somehow that made the story worse in the minds of the crew. If an ordinary human could survive Cryos 9 for 10 years through persistence alone, then what exactly were humans capable of when truly desperate? Varric visited the medical ward late during the ship's artificial night cycle. Ethan sat awake beside the observation glass, wrapped in thermal blankets, watching stars drift slowly through darkness. He no longer slept much. Part of him still expected emergency alarms whenever silence lasted too long. "You should be resting," Varric said quietly from the doorway. Ethan glanced back briefly. "Can't." The captain stepped beside him near the observation window. For several moments, both simply stared into space together. Cryos 9 had already vanished behind them into distant darkness, just another frozen point hidden among endless stars. "The Senate has requested your testimony immediately upon return," Varric said eventually. Ethan groaned softly. "That sounds terrible." Unexpectedly, Varric almost smiled. "Probably. Silence settled again afterward, not uncomfortable, just heavy with everything neither of them knew how to say. Finally, Varric spoke without looking at him. "I left you there." Ethan remained still. "Yes, I calculated survival probabilities and accepted operational necessity." The captain's voice remained calm, but something old and damaged moved beneath it. "For 10 years, I believed that decision killed you." Ethan stared out at the stars quietly. It almost did. Varric closed his eyes briefly. Ethan noticed then how much older the commander truly looked now. Guilt aged people differently than time. "But you came back," Ethan said softly. Varric looked toward him slowly. Ethan shrugged slightly through the blankets. "That matters." Neither spoke afterward for a while. Sometimes forgiveness sounded smaller than expected. A few days later, the Vindicator entered Union-controlled space. News networks intercepted the story immediately. "Human survives Cryos 9, 10 years alone." Every system across the Perseus sectors exploded with speculation and fascination. Ethan's survival became more than a rescue story almost overnight. It became mythology. Analysts debated human adaptability endlessly across scientific broadcasts. Military strategists quietly revised environmental survivability assessments involving Earth personnel. Frontier colonists began telling exaggerated stories about the human who refused to die beneath the ice world. None of it felt real to Ethan. Fame meant very little after spending a decade fighting generators and starvation in frozen tunnels. Mostly he wanted silence, warm food, maybe rain someday. The Vindicator crew celebrated him anyway. Not dramatically, no speeches or ceremonies, just small things. Extra meals delivered to his quarters, crew members stopping to thank him for reasons they could not fully explain, engineers asking about his shelter systems with open admiration. Even hardened security officers treated him carefully now, as though fearing he might somehow carry part of Cryos 9 inside him still. In a way, they were correct. One evening, Ethan sat alone inside the observation lounge, watching a distant nebula burn softly across space, while Mira floated nearby processing stellar cartography updates. The silence between them felt peaceful now instead of empty. "You are displaying reduced stress indicators," Mira observed. Ethan sipped hot coffee, slowly, real coffee. The smell alone still amazed him. Turns out not freezing constantly improves mood, humor acknowledged. Ethan glanced sideways toward the drone. "You've gotten better at that. Continued interaction with humans increases adaptive emotional modeling efficiency." Ethan smiled faintly. "Look at you using feelings." "Correction," Mira answered. "Understanding feelings." Ethan leaned back in the chair. Outside, the stars moved endlessly beyond the glass. For the first time in years, tomorrow no longer meant survival calculations. The idea still frightened him a little. "Mira," he said quietly after a while. "Yes, Ethan?" He stared at the reflection of the stars in the window. "What do you think kept me alive down there?" The AI processed the question longer than usual. Multiple factors contributed: human physiological resilience, behavioral adaptability, persistent routine maintenance, social attachment structures. Ethan laughed softly. "That sounds like a science report. Would you prefer an emotional answer?" Ethan looked toward the drone in surprise. "You have one?" Mira's optic sensor dimmed thoughtfully. "You continued because you believed tomorrow existed even when evidence suggested otherwise." Ethan became very still after hearing that. Outside the observation window, starlight drifted endlessly through darkness. Finally, he nodded once. "Yeah," he whispered. "I think that's it." The Vindicator reached the edge of the Perseus Drift 3 days later. As the ship accelerated toward the populated systems of the Union, Ethan stood once more beside the main observation deck windows with Varric nearby. Far behind them, invisible among billions of distant stars, Cryos 9 continued orbiting in silence beneath eternal storms. The planet remained unchanged, frozen, merciless, waiting for the next foolish species to underestimate it. Varric folded his hands behind his back. while watching the darkness beyond the glass. "The Union will study your survival for decades," he said quietly. Ethan grimaced slightly. "That sounds exhausting." "They will ask what allowed a human to endure conditions no other intelligent life could survive." Ethan thought about the question seriously for a long moment. He remembered Lena's final promise. Endless repairs beneath frozen tunnels, the beacon pulsing into silence year after year, dinners beside an empty chair, Mira learning what friendship meant inside the dead world. He remembered waking every day, knowing Cryos 9 would try killing him again before nightfall. And getting up anyway. "People think survival is strength," Ethan said finally. "It isn't." Varric looked toward him. Ethan kept his eyes on the stars. "It's stubbornness." The captain considered that quietly. Then slowly, almost reverently, he turned his gaze back toward the darkness where Cryos 9 waited unseen beyond the edge of known space. "No," Varric said softly. "It is humanity.